The village lay in a hollow carved by the mountains, a place where sunlight struggled to reach the narrow, cobbled streets and the cold winds whispered through the alleys like ghosts of forgotten times. It was isolated from the outside world, hemmed in by jagged cliffs and dense forests, where the echoes of life beyond rarely traveled. The people lived in a constant rhythm dictated by fear and obedience, their days measured by the dictates of those who ruled with cruelty, and their nights haunted by the threat of punishment. The village had long been under the iron fist of enforcers, men and women chosen not for wisdom or fairness but for strength and ruthlessness, who found amusement in domination and who thrived on the suffering of those they governed. Life in the village was harsh, regimented, and unforgiving. Every morning, the villagers awoke to the sound of the enforcers' horns, a shrill, piercing call that signaled the beginning of labor or the start of mandatory inspections. Tasks were assigned with little consideration for age, strength, or skill, and failure to comply was met with brutal discipline. Laborers would haul heavy stones from quarries under the burning sun or frozen rain, women would tend to livestock or gather firewood in dangerous terrain, and children were forced to perform chores far beyond their years, all under the watchful eyes of the enforcers. Punishments were public and humiliating. A person caught stealing, speaking out, or even hesitating in their duties might be lashed with ropes across the village square, left exposed to the jeers of neighbors, or forced to kneel on jagged stones until the skin was raw. Superstition intertwined with cruelty, the enforcers often claimed that the gods favored harshness and that the land itself demanded obedience, weaving fear into the villagers' faith and leaving them hesitant to question authority. Among these oppressed people was a young woman whose presence was quietly magnetic, though she did not seek attention. Her name was whispered softly among the villagers, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with envy. She was the heroine of this tale, though none yet knew the breadth of her strength. She was slight in stature, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and eyes that held a calm intelligence that seemed to see the very soul of the people around her. Her courage was not loud or boastful, it was quiet, steadfast, and steadfastly unyielding. She moved through the village with purpose, tending to the sick, helping the elderly carry water, and calming disputes among neighbors with a gentle word or a firm hand. Her empathy was not naive, she recognized the pain and suffering of others and acted with a balance of care and discernment that inspired those who dared to notice her. There were whispers in the village, murmurs that rose like faint smoke through the alleys and around the markets. Some said she possessed unusual strength, a force that could not be measured by muscle alone. They spoke of her moving boulders that others could not budge, of her walking through storms and snow without faltering, and of moments when she seemed to stand rooted in the earth itself, unshaken by the blows of fate or the cruelty of men. The villagers told stories to each other, quietly, in fear of the enforcers' ears. She is one with the land, some said. The stones and soil protect her. Though these were hushed words, they were repeated often enough to create an aura of awe around her presence, a delicate tension between hope and fear. The heroine's connection to the land was subtle but undeniable. She would walk barefoot along the riverbeds at dawn, feeling the cold stones beneath her feet, sensing the flow of water and the pulse of the earth beneath. She understood the rhythms of the seasons with an instinctive precision, predicting storms and droughts, knowing when to plant crops or harvest them with uncanny accuracy. Animals responded to her presence. Birds would circle above when she worked in the fields, foxes paused at the edges of the woods to watch her pass, and stray cats and dogs followed her quietly, drawn to her calm energy. Though the enforcers scoffed and dismissed these signs as coincidence or superstition, the villagers watched with a mixture of reverence and caution, sensing that she was not ordinary. Despite her quiet power and the respect she inspired among her peers, the heroine did not openly challenge the enforcers. She understood the delicate balance of survival in a village where one misstep could lead to pain, punishment, or death. Yet she did not allow herself to be cowed into submission. Small acts of defiance, a refusal to bow to unjust orders, a sharp word against cruelty, a hidden gesture of assistance to a weaker neighbor, rippled quietly through the community. Others began to notice, some in secret admiration, some with cautious envy, while the enforcers themselves grew wary of her presence, sensing that beneath her calm demeanor lay a force they could neither control nor fully comprehend. The village itself seemed to respond to her presence, subtly, as if the land recognized her and lent its support. During the long winters, when snow and ice threatened the village's survival, she would find paths through the mountains that others could not, guiding laborers and hunters safely back to their homes. During droughts, she would lead them to hidden springs or fertile plots of soil that had been overlooked, ensuring crops survived where they would have failed. Even in moments of despair, when punishment or fear had dampened the villagers' spirits, her calm confidence seemed to anchor them, offering a faint but persistent sense that survival was possible. Yet the enforcers remained oppressive, their cruelty a constant shadow over every act of kindness and courage. They punished without reason, terrorized without mercy, and manipulated superstition to keep the villagers subservient. They ridiculed her when they could, mocking her quiet defiance and the whispers that followed her steps. They tried to intimidate her with threats of public punishment, demanding obedience, and warning that no connection to the land would save her from their wrath. But each act of aggression against her seemed only to strengthen the sense of awe and quiet hope among the villagers, who watched her with bated breath and whispered prayers, uncertain whether they were witnessing miracles, strength, or something more profound yet to come. In this crucible of oppression the stage was set. The village, with its cobbled streets, narrow alleys and fearful inhabitants, existed under the heavy hand of the enforcers, its people trapped in cycles of submission and suffering. And at the heart of it, the young heroine moved like a quiet flame, resilient, observant, empathetic, and attuned to the power that the earth itself seemed to pulse through her. Whispers of her unusual strength and connection to the land spread through the village like sparks in dry grass, foreshadowing a reckoning that would come not through weapons or rage alone, but through the deep, primal force that lay beneath her feet, waiting for the moment when oppression would meet its match. The villagers, whether they realized it or not, were witnessing the early stages of a change that would ripple through every street, every home, and every shadowed corner of the village. The enforcers, confident in their dominion, did not yet understand that the heroine's quiet courage was anchored in something far older, far deeper than human strength, something. The morning began like any other, with the gray light of dawn stretching across the village rooftops and the distant peaks of the mountains standing silent against the cold horizon. The air was thick with the scent of smoke from the chimneys, mingled with the earthy odor of damp soil and livestock. Villagers stirred reluctantly, their bodies stiff from labor and the lingering fear of punishment, as the enforcers patrolled the streets with measured cruelty, watching for the slightest sign of disobedience. Today, however, a minor incident was about to ignite a spark that would ripple through the village and change the rhythm of fear that had held them captive for so long. A small group of villagers, mostly women and older children, had been sent to clear a section of the nearby forest for firewood. The enforcers demanded that they work faster than the season allowed, threatening flogging or public humiliation for anyone who lagged behind. The heroine had been among them, carrying heavy bundles of branches and observing the laborers with quiet concern. She noted how some struggled under the weight, faces pale with exhaustion, yet the enforcers paid no heed. Their eyes were sharp, their voices cutting, and their whips poised like extensions of their authority. Each snap of leather against wood or bark echoed like a warning through the forest, a cruel rhythm that enforced obedience without question. At one point an elderly man stumbled over a root, dropping his bundle. The enforcers descended upon him immediately, mocking his weakness and striking him with calculated blows. The villagers flinched, fear rooting them to the ground. The heroine's heart pounded with indignation and she stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering despite the tension surrounding her. "He has worked as hard as any of us," she said firmly. "The burden is too great and your cruelty is not the law, it is your fear speaking through violence." The enforcers froze for a heartbeat, taken aback by her audacity. They had grown used to whispers, to silent murmurs of discontent that never coalesced into direct confrontation. Her words, spoken with calm authority and intelligence, pierced the veil of fear that they relied upon. One of the senior enforcers, a tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek, sneered at her. "And who are you to question us, girl? Do you think the land itself bends for your words?" "I do not ask the land to bend," she replied, eyes steady, "but I ask you to see the suffering you impose. Strength does not come from cruelty, and authority does not come from fear. We are not your playthings nor the soil beneath your boots. We are alive and we deserve to be treated as such." Her words carried a weight beyond her size, a combination of intelligence, moral clarity, and quiet force that unnerved the enforcers. The scarred man's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the handle of his whip, but he did not strike. He realized, perhaps too late, that she was no ordinary villager. Her courage emanated from a place the enforcers could not control. The villagers, though still rooted in fear, began to watch in silence. Some exchanged nervous glances, the beginnings of hope flickering in their eyes. They had seen many speak against the enforcers and be punished without mercy, yet here was a young woman standing unflinching, articulating their shared suffering with clarity and reason. Whispers began to circulate quietly through the group. "She is different," one said. "She is not afraid." Another nodded, adding, "Perhaps there is someone among us who can speak for all of us, someone who sees truth even in the shadow of cruelty." The enforcers, sensing the shifting mood, tried to reassert control. They shouted orders, demanding compliance, threatening punishment once more. Yet each command seemed hollow in the presence of her unwavering stance. Even as they raised their whips, the heroine's calm composure and sharp wit made them hesitate. She did not shrink, did not bow, and did not lower her voice. Instead, she met their eyes, unafraid, and continued to speak. "Your strength is not yours alone. It is borrowed from the fear of others. True courage, true power, comes from protecting, not harming. You may strike my body, but my voice and the truth it carries cannot be broken." The enforcers, enraged by the subtle defiance that undermined their authority, decided to escalate their cruelty. They grabbed at her clothing, attempting to shove her to the ground and humiliate her in front of the laborers. She resisted physically with surprising agility and strength, pushing back just enough to avoid injury while maintaining her composure. Each motion was deliberate, not reckless, demonstrating control that both awed and unnerved the onlookers. The enforcers stumbled slightly, underestimating her resilience, their usual dominance challenged by someone they considered subordinate. The villagers, previously cowed by fear, began to murmur encouragements under their breath. They had longed for an exemplar, someone who could articulate their frustration and stand unbowed, and the heroine had filled that role in a way they had not dared to hope for. Her quiet courage inspired small gestures of solidarity, an elder offering a hand to help another carry wood, children mimicking her calm stance when threatened, and women standing taller under the enforcer's scrutiny. Each act, though subtle, began to weave a thread of resistance through the group, a fabric of collective courage and hope. As the confrontation unfolded, the enforcers' control weakened. Their authority had been absolute for generations, but the heroine's defiance illuminated a crack in their dominance. They had not faced someone who could wield both intellect and bravery in unison, someone whose strength was rooted not merely in muscle or weaponry but in moral clarity and connection to the people. The tension rose palpably. The village seemed to hold its collective breath, the forest around them silent as if watching, sensing the shift in power that was occurring on its periphery. Eventually, the enforcers withdrew, temporarily humiliated and cautious, realizing that further aggression might ignite the spark they feared. The heroine stood tall, bruised but unbroken, her presence a beacon to those who had silently suffered for too long. Word of the incident spread quickly among the villagers, whispered conversations growing in confidence and hope. People began to see that change, however slow or subtle, was possible. They recognized that courage could inspire courage, that one act of defiance could ripple outward, awakening dormant resolve in others. In the days that followed, the heroine's influence grew. She continued her work, tending to the sick, aiding the elderly, and quietly guiding the villagers in small acts of resistance that avoided immediate reprisal but built confidence and solidarity. The enforcers remained wary, their usual ease of intimidation challenged by someone who refused to yield. Meanwhile, the villagers began to watch her more closely, not with fear but with cautious hope, drawing inspiration from her every action, her every measured word. The spark of defiance had been lit, subtle yet powerful, a quiet force that promised change. It was a reminder that even in a village governed by fear and cruelty, courage, intelligence, and moral clarity could plant the seeds of resistance. The heroine had shown them that strength could manifest in quiet dignity, in measured defiance, and in the refusal to. The sun rose high above the village that morning, casting harsh light across the cobblestones and illuminating the square where the enforcers had chosen to display their cruelty. The air was crisp with early frost, and a bitter wind cut through the narrow alleys, rustling banners that bore the marks of authority and cruelty. Today the enforcers had decided that the heroine's defiance could not go unanswered. Her resistance, the words she had spoken, the courage she had displayed in the forest and fields, had shaken their pride and challenged their control. They would make an example of her, and the entire village would witness the cost of dissent. Word spread quickly through the streets, carried by terrified whispers and hurried runners. Villagers emerged from their homes reluctantly, peering from behind doors and shutters, forming clusters at the edges of the square. Mothers clutched children to their chests, while laborers paused in their tasks, eyes wide and faces pale. No one dared approach too closely, for the enforcer's reputation for brutality was well known. The square was soon filled with a tense silence, broken only by the creak of wooden gates and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. The heroine was dragged from her home, her feet stumbling on the uneven cobblestones as rough hands gripped her arms. She was dressed simply, her clothes torn in places from previous scuffles, but her posture remained upright and unwavering. Her eyes scanned the crowd briefly, meeting the fearful yet admiring gazes of those who had witnessed her defiance, and then she faced the enforcers, her expression calm but resolute. The enforcers, tall and imposing, surrounded her, their leather boots striking the stones with a threatening rhythm. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The lead enforcer, a man with broad shoulders and a face lined with scars, raised a whip, cracking it against the ground in a deliberate display of power. "Let this be a lesson to all who think they can speak against us," he bellowed. "No mercy will be shown to the defiant. The land itself will not save you when you are beaten for your insolence." His words, intended to terrify, were met with a hushed murmur among the villagers, who exchanged worried glances. Some clutched each other in secret solidarity, while others turned their faces away, unable to witness what they feared would unfold. The first lash struck her back with a sharp crack, making her gasp, but she did not fall. The leather tore at her skin, leaving crimson streaks that glistened in the sunlight. Each blow was deliberate, intended to break her body and spirit, yet she remained upright, bending slightly only to absorb the impact without collapsing. The enforcers increased their pace, whips cracking in a relentless rhythm, yet with every strike, a strange subtle vibration rose from the earth beneath their feet. It was so slight that neither the enforcers nor the villagers could place it immediately, a faint quiver like the heartbeat of the land itself stirring in response to injustice. Her arms were pinned and twisted behind her back as the blows continued, her body trembling under the assault, yet her gaze remained steady, unwavering. Blood streaked her cheeks, mixing with dirt and frost, but she did not cry out, except for the occasional sharp intake of breath. The crowd watched in awe, horrified by the brutality yet inspired by the heroine's resilience. Mothers pressed their children closer, whispering reassurances that were themselves uncertain, while laborers and tradesmen exchanged silent nods of admiration for her courage. The enforcers, growing frustrated by her unbroken spirit, escalated the punishment further. They struck with greater force, kicked at her shins and shoved her to the ground. She fell, face down against the rough stones, but even as she lay there battered and bloodied, the faint trembling beneath their boots grew stronger. Stones shifted slightly, dust rising in minute clouds around the edges of the square. Roots from trees at the square's perimeter crept imperceptibly upward, cracking the cobblestones with subtle pressure. The oppressors noticed only the minor shifts at first, shrugging them off as uneven paving or the natural settling of the earth. Yet the heroine felt the land beneath her respond, almost like a pulse of energy. Each whip strike, each shove, resonated through her body in harmony with the vibrations of the ground. Though she was physically assaulted, her connection to the land seemed to bolster her, lending her endurance and strength that should not have been possible. She lifted her head slightly, meeting the eyes of the enforcers with a steady defiance that unsettled them. Their cruelty, intended to break her, instead highlighted the resolve that burned quietly within her and the subtle, growing power that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Villagers could sense something shifting, though they did not understand what it was. Some felt the faint tremors beneath their feet, a vibration that set their hearts racing with a mix of fear and awe. Others noticed the slight rocking of barrels and crates, the way dust drifted from the corners of buildings, or the way small animals scurried and stared nervously toward the heroine. Whispers began circulating. "Do you feel that? The ground, it is alive." Another voice, trembling with disbelief, added, She is not ordinary." These murmurs, hushed and tentative, spread quickly, growing in volume as the beating continued. The heroine struggled to rise as the enforcers redoubled their efforts, but the subtle support of the earth beneath her lent her strength. She rolled to one side, narrowly avoiding a strike aimed at her head, and pushed herself up with a force that startled even the most seasoned oppressors. The ground beneath their boots began to tremble more noticeably now, small cracks forming along the stone-paved square. The enforcers hesitated, confusion flickering in their eyes as the subtle vibrations turned into a low, resonant hum, almost imperceptibly shaking their balance. As the beating continued, the heroine's endurance became legendary before the eyes of the villagers. They watched, some in horror, some in secret admiration, as she absorbed blow after blow, her spirit unbroken even as her body bore the marks of violence. Each lash, each shove, each kick was met with an unwavering gaze, a quiet defiance that radiated beyond the physical and into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Fear began to mingle with hope. The people saw that cruelty alone could not break her, that her strength was rooted in something deeper than flesh and bone. The enforcers, increasingly unnerved, began to falter in their rhythm. Their blows were no longer precise, their movements betrayed hesitation. Some stumbled slightly, sensing the subtle. The village square, still bathed in the harsh light of midday, seemed frozen in an uneasy silence. The enforcers had departed, leaving behind the battered figure of the heroine sprawled across the cobblestones. Her body was bruised, her skin streaked with blood and dirt, and her muscles trembled from the relentless beating she had endured. Yet even in this state of exhaustion and pain, something profound was stirring beneath her. The land itself, the very ground upon which she had been punished, seemed to respond to her suffering. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the earth, patient and eternal, had long observed the injustices inflicted upon her and the villagers, and it was ready to react. At first, it was a gentle vibration beneath her fingertips as she pressed them to the cobblestones. A faint tremor ran through the square, so slight that many of the villagers assumed it was the uneven stones shifting underfoot. But she felt it clearly, a pulsing energy that resonated with her own strength and endurance. The sensation was not frightening but awakening, like the heartbeat of the earth itself aligning with her own. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to sense the rhythm, feeling a deep connection with the soil, the stones, and the roots that curled beneath the village in silent networks of life. The tremors grew gradually, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Small stones at the edges of the square shifted slightly, rolling across the cobblestones with soft, grinding sounds. Roots, long buried and intertwined beneath buildings and paths, began to push upward imperceptibly, cracking the stone and soil as they searched for release. Tiny fissures formed along the paving, almost invisible at first, then widening with a deliberate, almost sentient force. The ground beneath the enforcer's former feet pulsed with energy, responding to her connection, to the injustice that had been inflicted, and to the collective fear and awe of the villagers who watched silently from doorways and alleys. Animals, long accustomed to the rhythms of the earth, sensed the disturbance. Birds took flight from rooftops, their wings beating in urgent flurries, while dogs and cats emerged from hiding places, ears perked and tails stiff, sensing the power that emanated from the heroine and the soil. Rodents scurried from the cracks of the village walls, and even the livestock shifted uneasily, stamping hooves and lowing in a chorus of instinctive alarm. The natural world seemed to respond before the human observers could fully comprehend the awakening that was taking place, a subtle reminder that the land itself was alive and attentive to the actions inflicted upon its people. The oppressors, who had so recently wielded power over the village with ruthless confidence, were the first to feel the tremors in a more immediate sense. They had returned to the square, intending to ensure the heroine's punishment had left its mark on her spirit as well as her body. Yet their boots met with the first true shakes of the earth. A stone shifted beneath one enforcer's heel, causing him to stumble slightly, while a root cracked through the paving at another's feet, sending a jolt up his leg. They glanced at one another, unease flickering in their eyes, but quickly dismissed the occurrences as coincidence, attributing the tremors to poor masonry or an old foundation settling under the sun's heat. They underestimated the heroine's connection to the earth, assuming that her strength was purely human, limited, and that she had been broken by their cruelty. But the heroine knew differently. Lying on the cold, uneven cobblestones, she sensed the energy pooling beneath her. Each breath she drew seemed to draw in more of the earth's subtle power, linking her spirit to the soil, to the roots, and to the stones themselves. She was aware of every vibration, every shift, and every pulse, feeling the land as an extension of her own body, a silent ally ready to rise in defense. Pain coursed through her limbs, but it was balanced by a rising strength that emanated from the very ground, a quiet, inexorable force that promised to protect her when human cruelty would not. As the tremors intensified, the villagers began to notice. The initial subtle shifts in stones and dust were easy to dismiss, but as the ground quaked more noticeably, their fear mingled with astonishment. Windows rattled in their frames and small items on shelves trembled and toppled. The air was filled with an almost imperceptible hum, like the deep resonance of a drum vibrating through the earth. Murmurs rose among the watchers. "Do you feel that?" one whispered. "The ground, it moves." Another added, "It is her, it must be her. She calls the earth." The villagers, who had been paralyzed by fear, now felt a flicker of hope, the beginnings of realization that the heroine's strength might extend beyond mere human resilience. The roots continued their slow uprising, pressing against cobblestones and cracks in the walls, lifting stones with a force that seemed both deliberate and intelligent. Small fissures ran through the square, widening imperceptibly as the tremors increased in frequency and intensity. Dust fell from the corners of buildings and loose debris rolled slightly across the ground, startling some of the villagers and causing others to clutch at each other in awe. The air seemed charged with an unseen energy, vibrating subtly against skin and bone, signaling the presence of a power long dormant but now stirring in response to injustice and cruelty. The enforcers, still underestimating the situation, attempted to maintain order. They shouted, waved their arms and demanded obedience, but their voices lacked authority, drowned by the subtle hum of the earth and the rising tension in the square. Each step they took was met with shifting stones or the push of roots beneath their feet, and though they tried to ignore it, the unease grew. One enforcer stumbled over a small fissure, losing balance momentarily, and another jerked as the ground beneath him shifted in a way that could not be easily explained. Their confidence faltered, though they refused to admit it, their minds unwilling to reconcile the idea that the heroine might truly wield such influence over the land itself. As the heroine struggled to rise from the cold cobblestones, supported subtly by the energy of the earth beneath her, the tremors became more pronounced. The ground heaved slightly, causing loose stones to roll and dust to billow from corners and cracks. Birds swooped low and small animals scurried frantically, responding instinctively to the awakening power. Even the village walls, old and worn, seemed to shiver, their cracks widening ever so slightly as the energy spread outward from the square's center. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, a palpable force that seemed to connect the heroine to every stone, every root, every living thing in the vicinity. The villagers watched, captivated and horrified in equal measure. Mothers pressed their children closer, while elders clutched walking sticks or canes, uncertain whether to flee or remain. Yet beneath the fear lay a growing admiration, a realization that the heroine was more than a mere mortal, that she had survived brutality not only through courage but through a connection to the living earth. They whispered to one another, "She is one with the land, the earth itself will not allow her to be destroyed, and perhaps she is chosen or protected by forces beyond our understanding." The heroine's awareness of the land's energy continued to grow. Even as pain racked her body, the subtle tremors bolstered her spirit, allowing her to push herself up with a strength that seemed impossible for one so battered. Her eyes opened, scanning the square with a sharp clarity, and she sensed the energy extending outward, watching the enforcers, warning them, signaling that their cruelty had consequences beyond human retaliation. Each heartbeat, each breath, each flicker of the earth beneath her resonated in synchrony, reinforcing her resolve and deepening the connection that had begun in whispers and subtle vibrations. The enforcers, oblivious to the true nature of the awakening, grew increasingly frustrated. Their usual tools of fear, whips, intimidation and public humiliation, had no effect on the heroine now. The subtle shaking beneath their feet, which they had dismissed as coincidence, began to influence their movements, making them hesitant and uncertain. They stepped lightly, avoiding cracks and shifts in the stones, yet unable to fully ignore the growing force. Their authority, once absolute, felt suddenly fragile, and a seed of doubt began to take root in their minds, though they struggled to acknowledge it openly. Meanwhile, the animals continued to respond instinctively to the disturbance. Birds cawed and swooped low, flocks moving in synchronized patterns that suggested urgency. Cats and dogs pressed close to walls and corners, ears swiveling and muscles tense. Even the livestock sensed the change, stamping and shifting uneasily in their pens, some breaking free to move closer to the square, drawn by curiosity or instinct. The living world seemed to align with the heroine's connection, a subtle symphony of life responding to her presence and the injustice she had endured. As the day wore on, the tremors persisted, gradually becoming more pronounced yet still controlled, as if the earth itself were testing its own limits and gauging the heroine's intent. She rose fully, her body battered but her spirit intact, and the subtle quivering beneath her feet followed her every movement. The villagers, now witnessing the extraordinary manifestation of her connection to the land, began to murmur in hushed tones of admiration and awe. Fear lingered, but it was tempered by a burgeoning hope, the realization that someone among them possessed not only courage but a bond with the living world that could challenge the oppressive order of the enforcers. The heroine stood at the center of the square, bruised and bloodied yet empowered, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her as a source of strength. The enforcers, finally aware that their control was slipping, exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that they faced not merely a resilient human but a force intertwined with the very land itself. The subtle tremors continued, growing imperceptibly stronger, signaling the awakening of a power that had lain dormant but now surged in quiet, unstoppable anticipation. The villagers' perception of reality shifted that day. What had begun as a public display of cruelty became the first chapter of a reckoning. The heroine's defiance, combined with the subtle but undeniable response of the earth, planted the seeds of hope and resistance. They understood, without fully grasping the mechanics, that the heroine was not alone, that her strength drew from a source far older and more powerful than human authority, and that the land itself was awakening to defend what had been unjustly harmed. This was the moment when oppression met an unyielding force, the heroine, battered but unbroken, and the living earth, quietly rising in response to injustice. It was subtle yet profound, unnoticed fully by the oppressors but felt instinctively by all who had eyes to see and ears to hear. The ground had awakened, the connection had deepened, and the first tremors of change had begun to ripple outward from the heart of the village, signaling that a reckoning was inevitable, and that the heroine's path of resistance was only just beginning. The village square had transformed into a place of both awe and fear. The heroine, once battered and bloodied from the enforcer's brutal public punishment, now stood fully upright, her body trembling slightly from the exertion, but her spirit alight with a quiet, unstoppable energy. The subtle tremors that had begun as faint pulses beneath her feet had intensified, becoming waves of motion that rippled through the soil, stones, and roots of the square. Each pulse seemed to answer her will, moving in tandem with her thoughts, her determination, and her deep connection to the earth beneath her. What had once been merely a subtle awakening of power was now a tangible, forceful movement that reshaped the terrain and challenged the oppressive authority of the enforcers. The first wave of upheaval began as a quiver beneath their boots, subtle yet enough to throw one of the enforcers off balance. His eyes widened in confusion, and his arms flailed as he tried to regain stability, but the ground shifted again beneath him, more violently this time. Loose cobblestones rattled and rolled, roots that had crept quietly beneath the surface now rose with deliberate intent, obstructing paths and creating barriers between the heroine and her attackers. Dust fell from the edges of roofs, stirring in small clouds that caught the sunlight and shimmered in the air, as if the very village itself was participating in the unfolding miracle. The enforcers, previously confident in their ability to control and punish, now found themselves in disarray. Their boots slipped on the uneven ground, stones tumbled beneath their weight, and roots twisted upward, tangling at their feet and throwing off their balance. They shouted commands, attempting to coordinate their attack, but their voices carried a tremor of fear, uncertainty creeping into every word. One enforcer fell to his knees, struggling to rise, while another stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a jagged root that had thrust itself between the cobblestones. Every movement they made was impeded, as though the land itself conspired against them, amplifying the heroine's defiance and punishing their cruelty. The heroine felt the energy of the earth responding to her thoughts and intent. Where before she had been lifted subtly by the tremors, now she began to guide them deliberately, directing the waves of shaking to impede her oppressors without causing unnecessary harm. The ground buckled beneath them, rising in small waves that caught them off guard, roots lashing outward to block their paths, and stones shifting to trip their steps. Her connection to the land was no longer passive. She could feel the pulse, the rhythm, and the potential of every root and stone, and she manipulated it with precision and care. Villagers, who had initially watched in fear and awe, now began to stir with cautious bravery. Mothers held their children tightly, yet some stepped forward tentatively, picking up fallen tools or sticks, ready to support the heroine in whatever way they could. Laborers and tradesmen, emboldened by the extraordinary display of power, moved closer to assist, though their actions were careful and deliberate, mindful of both the tremors beneath their feet and the unpredictable strength of the land itself. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "It is her power," one said, voice trembling with wonder. "She controls the earth itself," another whispered. The sense of witnessing a miracle, a convergence of human spirit and elemental force, spread quickly, filling hearts with both hope and reverent fear. The enforcers struggled to maintain control, their authority crumbling under the combined weight of fear, imbalance, and the heroine's deliberate manipulation of the earth. One attempted to strike her with a heavy staff, but the ground beneath his feet buckled, sending him sprawling. Another tried to charge, only to have a root twist upward at the perfect moment, entangling his legs and forcing him to crash against a pile of fallen stones. The heroine moved with grace despite her bruises and exhaustion, each step synchronized with the subtle tremors that now obeyed her will. She could lift or drop waves of the ground, shift stones, and direct roots as extensions of her body, transforming the terrain into both shield and weapon. The villagers began to assist more actively, though cautiously. Some grabbed loose stones and tossed them at the enforcers when the earth itself could not intervene quickly enough. Others pushed fallen beams or carts to obstruct the paths of the oppressors, amplifying the effect of the heroine's manipulation of the land. The miracle unfolded slowly but inexorably. A community that had been silenced by fear now witnessed the embodiment of resistance, a single figure empowered by both spirit and earth, supported subtly and strategically by the land and increasingly by their own brave actions. The ground continued to rise and fall beneath the oppressors' feet in waves of controlled upheaval. Each pulse caused them to stumble, forcing them to divert energy to maintain balance rather than attack. The stones that shifted underfoot created obstacles that made movement perilous, while the roots lashed outward in careful arcs, impeding their advance. The heroine's eyes swept the square, calculating the patterns of movement, predicting the responses of both oppressors and villagers, and directing the subtle energy beneath her with a combination of instinct and conscious control. Every motion of the land was deliberate, designed to protect herself and those who dared to aid her, while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of unchecked cruelty. The enforcers, growing increasingly desperate, began to shout and strike indiscriminately, attempting to regain authority through brute force. But their strikes were ineffective. The ground buckled beneath them at the precise moment, throwing off their aim. Stones shifted unexpectedly, catching them mid-step, while roots twisted and coiled, unbalancing them further. Their coordination broke down completely, fear now overtaking anger as they realized they faced an adversary unlike any they had encountered. Not a single human but a conduit for the living earth itself. The villagers, witnessing the heroine's control and the enforcers faltering, felt their own courage swell. Some began to move closer, offering support through small acts, lifting obstacles, assisting those who stumbled, or shielding weaker villagers from falling debris. Their actions, tentative at first, gained confidence as the land's energy flowed visibly and tangibly through the heroine. Together, the community and the elemental force she commanded formed a unified front that amplified the power of the heroine, creating a scene of both miraculous resistance and collective awakening. The waves of the ground's upheaval became increasingly precise as the heroine's control grew. She could lift and lower sections of cobblestones to redirect the movements of the enforcers, create barriers of roots and stones, and maintain clear pathways for villagers assisting her. The square, once a place of punishment and oppression, had transformed into a dynamic battlefield where the terrain itself was an ally, moving in harmony with her intentions. Her bruises and bloodied form contrasted sharply with the power she now wielded, a testament to resilience and the awakening of latent forces long overlooked by those who ruled through fear. Battlefield, under the heroine's command, had become unpredictable and unmanageable for those who had sought to enforce cruelty, and every movement reinforced the lesson that their dominance was no longer guaranteed. The heroine, feeling the energy of the land fully responding to her will, pushed further. Waves of subtle upheaval rolled outward from her feet, lifting stones to impede the enforcers, raising roots to create barriers, and subtly tilting the ground to favor villagers assisting her. Her control was not destructive for destruction's sake but deliberate, precise, and protective. She had become both shield and spear, a force that defended herself and those who dared to resist alongside her. Every tremor, every shift, every pulse was guided with intent, demonstrating her mastery over the power that had previously lain dormant. Villagers, emboldened by the heroine's control and the tangible evidence of the land's support, began to act with increasing confidence. Some formed chains to move debris into strategic positions, others guided frightened neighbors to safer areas, and some called out to those trapped or hesitant, encouraging them to participate. Fear remained, of course, but it was now interlaced with awe and hope, the realization that they were witnessing a miracle, a convergence of human courage and elemental power that could alter the balance of authority in their village. The enforcers, disoriented and frightened, attempted one last coordinated effort to subdue the heroine. They advanced together, shouting commands, swinging sticks and rods, and trying to maintain a semblance of order. But the ground shifted unpredictably beneath them, rocks tumbled in carefully timed sequences, roots rose in arcs that obstructed movement, and the heroine's guidance of the energy rendered their efforts ineffective. Each strike, each step, each attempt to regain control failed, reinforcing their growing sense of helplessness. The heroine, fully empowered despite the bruises and exhaustion that marked her body, moved deliberately across the square, her steps synchronized with the subtle but deliberate tremors beneath her. She could feel the pulse of the earth, the alignment of stones and roots, and the precise timing required to manipulate them to protect herself and aid the villagers. Each movement was calculated, controlled, and infused with intention, a combination of instinct, awareness, and the rising mastery of her connection to the living ground. As the battle continued, the square became a testament to the turning of power. The enforcer's authority, long assumed to be unshakable, had been undermined by both human resilience and elemental force. The heroine, her body bruised but spirit unbroken, had not only survived but now dominated the terrain, using the awakening energy of the land to her advantage. The villagers, witnessing the miracle, began to understand that courage, connection, and collective action could challenge oppression in ways they had never imagined. The ground heaved rhythmically, stones rolled in controlled patterns, roots twisted to impede movement, and dust rose in shimmering clouds. Every element of the square had become an extension of the heroine's will, a tangible manifestation of resistance. The enforcers faltered repeatedly, unable to predict or counter the movements, their confidence eroded entirely. The villagers, increasingly emboldened, moved cautiously yet purposefully to aid the heroine, reinforcing the miraculous turn of events. By mid-afternoon, the tide of the confrontation had shifted decisively. The enforcers were disoriented, exhausted, and demoralized, while the heroine, standing tall despite her battered body, exuded a calm authority amplified by the living force of the earth. The villagers, inspired by the spectacle, began to see a path to liberation, a proof that oppression was neither eternal nor invincible. The turn of the battle had become a moment of awakening, a convergence of courage, elemental power, and communal participation, signaling the beginning of a new chapter in the village's history. The heroine, now fully in command of the tremors and upheavals beneath her feet, felt a profound sense of clarity and purpose. Each wave of the ground, each shift of stone or root, was an extension of her will, a protective mechanism for herself and the villagers, and a deliberate disruption to those who had sought to impose cruelty. The battle, once a test of endurance, had transformed into a demonstration of control, mastery, and the deep, unbreakable bond between human spirit and the living earth. The enforcers, battered by the land itself, began to retreat, their authority shattered, their fear palpable. The villagers, emboldened and inspired, began to emerge from hiding, assisting cautiously, their actions reinforcing the heroine's control over the square. The turn of the battle was complete, the oppressors humbled, the heroine empowered, and the village awakened to the possibility of resistance, hope, and the miraculous force that could rise from connection, courage, and the living earth itself.